Well, good afternoon. Thanks for hanging in there today. Our program today is going to be Converged Cloud Security. I have Clifford Cox here, Min Kyriannis, and Stephen Van Til. And we're going to be talking about on-premise versus cloud access control. And we'll talk through what factors you might consider when determining which architecture you might want to use. Go through a cloud security analysis and cybersecurity considerations, our on-prem analysis and cybersecurity considerations, and then what do you think about when you do the total cost of ownership analysis. So with that, Steve, why don't you start us off and talk a little bit about what is cloud?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The list that you see up here is the canonical definition from NIST on what is cloud, and it gets pretty thick pretty quickly, so I'm not going to go through all of the pieces. I think a couple of the really important ones, though, are, first of all, the on-demand self-service. So the fundamental premise of the cloud, whether you're looking at access control or CRM, is that you're only paying for what you're using. And so the metric can be doors in the case of access control, or it can be cameras in the case of video surveillance, or it can be users or seats in the case of CRM or financial systems. But that whole principle that you're only paying for what you're consuming, a lot of people call it pay by the drink, is kind of the centerpiece, in contrast with having to make a big investment in hardware and software licensing and things like that, and then slowly ramping up to make the consumption of that kind of make sense. So that one's very important. The second one out of the list that I think is very important is multi-tenancy. And in this case, we're talking about software multi-tenancy, which is very similar to the notion of multi-tenancy in a physical property. And that is that all of the clients, all of the customers are using the same instance of the software of the system. The reason that that's important for you as a buyer, or for you as somebody who might be selling this or recommending this to end users, is that's the core piece that allows sharing of resources, which is how this scales economically. So multi-tenancy isn't just an option, it's a core principle for getting the economic benefits out of the model. The opposite of multi-tenancy is putting one instance of the software in a virtual server for each and every client. And all that does really is to move servers from the client location back to some other cloud location, but it doesn't change the fundamental economics.
Excellent. I think we're seeing some trends in the industry. Why don't we talk a little bit about that as well?
Sure. So I know this is impossible to read from where most of you are sitting, but what this is showing is the general market, meaning all business applications that are currently in use. And the survey covers a wide swath of the U.S. business community. And the tipping point that's called out on here is showing that as of 2018, more than half of all businesses were doing more than 80% of their computing in the cloud. So it's more than half are doing more than 80% of their computing in the cloud across all application types. And of course, that graph just keeps going up and to the right until you get to 80%, 90%, and ultimately probably, something north of that. So that's the tipping point. The reason that I like to put this out is that it's probably obvious to anybody who thinks about it that the security industry technology adoption lags the rest of the IT community and enterprise application space by 4 or 5 years. Some people feel that's generous. Some people think it's longer. But it's important to see where the rest of the world is going, because that tells us where we will ultimately go, as we have with every other technology trend. So last piece of outside market analysis here. This one comes from IHS. This is their compounded growth chart for access control as a service and video surveillance as a service over the next 5 years. And if you look at where these bars end, they're kind of right around 120% growth for this part of the market for these two particular technologies. And so this is in contrast with the prior graph, showing us that we are catching up. We're not behind, or not going to stay behind forever. And so to me, this is a very optimistic view of the point where we're beginning to catch up with the tipping point that much of the rest of the enterprise applications have already reached.
And I don't think we'd be thorough if we didn't really talk about the different cloud-based delivery models. So Cliff, maybe you can talk us through that.
So Steve did something kind of, did you see it? It was very nuanced there. We started off with cloud as a technology, right? And you've got the NIST definition and elasticity and all of those things that go with that. And then we talked all of a sudden from a security perspective about services. And what's that got to do with cloud in a way? So I built this chart to kind of clarify that. Every conversation I seem to get into with an end user or an integrator that's new to this space, the first thing I have to figure out is, and they say they want to move something to the cloud. The first question is, what do you mean by cloud? Okay, and it's as a technology base, it was those things that NIST listed. But from a delivery perspective, there are new business models that accrued around that set of technologies over the course of time. So cloud these days probably means some combination of those things. And typically when I talk to customers, a lot of them, when they say cloud, all they're really talking about is moving their computers off-site into a public data center. And maybe the only reason they're doing that is because IT told them to, if they're big enough to have an IT group, or because they've recognized a cost-out advantage. And they may not understand some of these notions of multi-tenancy in doing that. They just think if they can get it off-site, they can save money. But the moment you get it off-site and you put it into a public data center, you're essentially, what you're doing, instead of buying that equipment, you're typically leasing that equipment. And if you're leasing that equipment, typically somebody is running that equipment for you. So this notion of services gets intermingled with this notion of technology here. And especially in the security space, the type of service that's delivered to you as the end user or the integrator providing the security solution matters. So again, if a customer simply wants to get their computing off-site, they're really talking about consuming infrastructure as a service. They're paying a utility bill on an operational basis monthly for the consumption of those virtual machines in almost all instances, that fraction of a computer that they're using over that period of time. But you can go up beyond that and consider additional services that could be delivered by that cloud data center provider, beyond just the compute and the networking and the storage and the air conditioning and the electricity. They can also offer to take care of the operating systems for you, update them, maybe Active Directory services, recovery services. There's a series of services that they can offer on top of just the bare metal that you can purchase and consume. And what does that save you as an end user? It saves you the tasks of doing those things yourself. So typically you see cloud providers providing these sets of services, and you need to talk to the integrators and the end users, or whoever the collection of people is that you're discussing the security solution with, to understand, is that what they're after, or are they after more? And oftentimes you'll start with those infrastructure types of capabilities, but then over the course of the conversation, you'll discover that they're actually even willing to offset some of the actual operational disciplines of running the security applications themselves. And that's where the vendors come in, like Brivo and others, that offer the actual security application as a service. And so you can purchase that as a service, and those application vendors will basically take care of the update and the maintenance and all of those other things that go with the actual application. And then beyond that, we live in a world with value-added resellers and other integrators. Oftentimes you'll see those integrators offer additional business services on top of that. So you get the application software as a service and you're paying on an operational basis for that, but maybe the integrator will offer to take care of the credential management or the badge printing for you, or the monitoring and management of the actual health of the application software itself. So there's this hierarchy of services that are available, and you need to basically discuss this with the end user to understand where their needs are. And in my experience, the end user's needs are really kind of a function of the environmental complexity that they live in and their security needs overall and their desire for control. So all of this needs to kind of be fleshed out as part of the discussion over what the solution is that they ultimately want.
And I would encourage, if you have a question as we're going through this, please just raise your hand and we'll take care of that on the spot.
So kind of building off of this, I have this mental model in my head, and which means it's probably 60% right half the time and fundamentally wrong the rest of the time. So I throw it out here basically to kind of solicit some conversation. But just building off that previous conversation, what I've found today, in today's environment, is that at the lower end of the market, simple facilities, 6 to 12 doors, 50 to 100 people, whatever, that same number of cameras possibly, facilities that are run by business generalists, they typically are looking for that whole stack. They're perfectly happy to purchase the entire software as a service, as a solution for their needs. They don't have security staff, they don't have IT staff, they have no desire to run this stuff or to manage it. So a full concierge kind of delivery makes sense in that space, in that segment area. And at the opposite end, you have very large corporations where they have very highly professional security staff, they have large IT staffs. They want that part that we were talking about at the beginning, just getting all that stuff off-site, taking advantages of the economies of scale of the data center, but they still want to control the applications. They still want to manage those places. They have highly secured environments that they need to manage. So maybe a concierge type of service from a third-party provider doesn't make sense to them. And then somewhere in the middle, you get hybridized versions where you have a collection of both types of solutions coexisting with each other. Now, my view is this is where we are today. Over the course of time, it's going to be really fascinating to watch. My expectation is the full concierge type of service is going to move up into the mid-market in the enterprise space. The question is over what period of time and what does it really look like when we get there? But today, this is how I kind of see it shaking out when you're looking at opportunities to leverage cloud technologies.
So, Min, as you're consulting to your clients, what are the things that you're stepping them through as you guide them down this path?
So as a consultant, we all have to be agnostic. So I came from a customer side as well, 25 years on customer side before I went to consultancy. So I took a lot of the lessons learned as a customer and brought it into consultancy. So one of the key things in determining whether to have access control in the cloud or not is determinant on who's running it. Is it IT or is it OT? You have two different groups that are actually now battling each other for control of the system. So if you're talking OT, sometimes physical security groups actually sit on the OT side. Sometimes they sit on the IT side. So depending on how it is, you have to facilitate the conversation, whether it's going to be on-prem or off-prem. Typically with the OT side, they don't want it on-prem because one, the IT probably doesn't want to have it on. And then if it's on the IT side, they want to run it. They want to run all the access controls. They want to run all the entire systems. They want to have everything on-prem. But then you also have the folks that actually want to have it in the middle because real estate, and I come from New York City where all the real estate is a huge market and you're talking expensive. So the less they have to occupy any real estate space, the better it is for the landlord. So they want to cut that out as much as possible. So they would take a look at the hybrid system. Right? And again, structure a company, who owns it, ownership. One of the key things that I found in terms of structure is control. Who is managing the credentials? If it's not the IT team and it's the OT team, those guys have no idea how to run any type of credential management. So typically what they want to do is look for managed services at that point, and we try to help find the right companies for that. On top of that, depending on the clientele that you have, we also have very complex and enterprise clients, which means it's a very complex environment. Perfect example is back in NYU, I was handling 16 global sites. We had a bunch of sites in the Middle East, which had a dedicated security team, so everything was run on-prem. The minute we got off site to Australia and Sydney, where we actually had a site, there was no security team. So we had to look for managed services at that point to actually put devices on their edge and have a cloud service to help facilitate that access control. So that way it interconnects back to New York to get the right access into these buildings. And then customers, expectations, big component of head. I usually deal with the C-suite level. So they have an expectation in terms of what kind of system they want to have in place. Sometimes it's unrealistic, very unrealistic, I will say that, because they don't want anything in their rooms, and that's not possible, whether it's on-prem or off in the cloud. So we have to get those expectations met. Occasionally we meet in the middle, so it becomes a hybrid system, which I'm seeing quite a bit of right now. But again, it really depends on clientele. More sophisticated ones typically just want to push in the cloud, but there's obviously ramifications on security and how you want to manage that. So that's things to think about. And again, head-end space. That one is always, whether you're in IT or in OT or in physical security, one of the key things that we talk about is head-end rooms. How much space is it going to take up in my rooms? And the real estate utilization is a big one. So it's great to have an cloud service for that respect because it diminishes that real estate substantially. So again, it really depends on the client that we're working with. If it's a sophisticated clientele where we can sit down and talk to them about the different varieties of services, great. Majority of the time, we don't get that. So you actually have to handhold these people in these discussions. And then I have to rely on you guys to come in and say, hey guys, we have to explain this in layman terms. So
Absolutely.
Apologies on that.
Yes, sir.
Do you see a
Hold on, we gotta have the microphone.
Do you see a difference with customers, so government customers saying we're only on-prem for difference of sharing data versus corporate America saying, hey, we want to go everything cloud because yada, yada, yada.
So there's some, so I head cybersecurity at this point. So one of the big things with government is typically they don't want anything on the cloud. They like it to be on-prem. I mean, they're very strict on the DoD requirements in that respect there. Financial organization, corporations, they're migrating to the cloud again in Manhattan for specific reasons. Real estate, it's expensive to run a data center. So typically it's just another data center offsite at a location that's not in the building. But they have very stringent requirements on how they set up the cloud services. So that has to be discussed and articulated in a contract. And if that's not done there, it's gonna be very, very messy.
But you do see these days like FedRAMP.
Oh, yeah.
So there's tire kicking going on
Somewhat,
by the
yeah.
government. How much of that's turning into real business, I don't know, but there definitely is some interest out there.
There's some interest, but I don't think on the high, critical areas. I think
Sure.
it's mostly on the building areas, like the EPA probably is
Yeah.
looking at that.
Question.
Phil?
You talked about the government want on-prem. Is that what you?
On-prem, yeah.
On-prem. Yet you see these contracts for CIA, for others that are AWS. That doesn't seem to.
So-
Help me
go ahead.
understand.
If I could take that one, Phil, just based on my own experience of being deep inside the GSA, which runs an awful lot of the access control for the government. And this was during the last presidential administration when Cloud First was kind of the marching orders along with data center consolidation and the rest of that. The head of the GSA, which is where the building management service lives, was very, very pro-cloud. So was the CIO, the CTO. 100% of the administration officials and cabinet level people were in favor of the cloud. And what I found at the operational level was individual security managers saying, I'll go cloud when they walk into my office and tell me I have to. And so there's kind of this dug-in mentality there. And I also think that there's a lot of comfort with continuing to use the software and the system that you already know how to use. Because if you've been on brand X for the last 12 years, part of your pride as system operator is I'm really good at brand X, right? And so those people were very reluctant to move. And there wasn't the connectivity between the positioning of the government and the individual security domains to make that happen. At least that's what I saw.
No, but again, it's really dependent on clientele. Yes, it's very, and I think you nailed it. It's like two different teams butting heads again. And I like to say that because IT and OT and also the C-suite level wants everything. But on the reality, you have day two operators that are actually managing the system that may not necessarily want to take it on because it's something new that they have to learn.
So who wins?
Usually the operators, sometimes. Majority of the times it's the operators. Because the reality is if they don't understand the system, no matter how much money you put into the system, it's not going to work. Because if they don't know how to operate, it's useless.
Yet, Steve, you showed that 80-20, 51% of them over 80. So it seems like moving to the cloud, but you're saying government is farther behind on that, and that the private sector. I'm just trying to make sense of it.
So you want to?
Yeah, so I think the government is, you get different answers in different parts. So the examples that you provided, DoD is doing tons of stuff in the cloud. CIA is using cloud. FBI is using cloud. Nearly every agency is now using Gmail, which is in the cloud. They're all using Salesforce, which is in the cloud. So it's a little bit of talking out of both sides of their mouth, and it's got pockets of resistance,
But again, ask the question, at what level are they utilizing the cloud? We're back to this whole notion of is it infrastructure as a service or platform or software, business applications, and you just listed a whole span of them, right, in that one sentence.
Business applications,
So
majority of the time,
that's as critical a question as whether or not you're going to the cloud, is how you're consuming it.
And it's even the same for building management systems. A lot of the companies are trying to get into cloud very quickly, like wireless thermostats. The problem with that is the minute you implement something into the cloud without actually putting proper security parameters in it, you're going to be compromised. There's vulnerabilities based on that, such as a 2017 hack. I think everybody knows about this with the infamous casino in Vegas in the aquarium with the thermostat that was hacked. Yeah. So situations like this is stuff that you want to avoid. So the cloud is great, but again, it depends on who you're talking to and who the customer is. If you have different teams that are actually talking and trying to negotiate the cloud services, that's where you're stepping on a very delicate ground there because yes, C-suite wants the cloud because it's easy, but they too can't manage it right now. So what do you do?
All right, so it became a little difficult as we were putting this thing together to try and keep to this is access control. This is an access control discussion. So we pulled together a pros and cons because if you're going to stand and articulate this to a client, we have to have a platform for that. So certainly on the pro side for cloud, being accessible to data more freely, we're not tethered to a hardwired thick client any longer. The data can potentially be backed up without the site effort and cost, so you're really pushing that off site. You're eliminating the cost, of course, of local servers, and you've got some predictable costs that you can project over time. With the automatic updates, we're not relying upon somebody to go to the site and do these things manually. And when those updates are made, they're simultaneously deployed. So that's always a good thing. The managed service, again, it's a fit for some, not for all, but this cloud certainly creates the opportunity for that, as well as the savings for your IT department. And then, of course, enhanced performance with large data center monitoring and all the benefits that come along with that, and the potential for redundancy without the cost of multiple servers as well. A lot would argue the total cost of ownership is lower operating in the cloud. I think you've got to develop your calculators for that, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of those factors in a bit. And the servers being monitored constantly is obviously a benefit as well. And then, reduced opening of the ports in the network. So on the downside, of course, you've got the recurring fees. I believe that there's a lagging in the video unification because it's really difficult for most organizations, even with a small number of clients. They do not want to consume that bandwidth to have video on the cloud. I know that's changing, but to me, that's a bit of a downside. And then when you start, as Cliff indicated, getting into the large building environments where you've got a lot of integration to other building management systems, cloud may be a little bit handicapped in terms of keeping those relationships with those other systems intact. And then, of course, you're going to lose some connectivity if the internet is down, and we'll talk about that same problem on the on-prem when you lose your local area network, but nonetheless, it's something to take into account. And then, as I look at the feature sets, cloud access control, in some cases, some of the new entrants to the markets, they don't have the feature sets of some of the on-prem access control software platforms. So that's something when you look at what are we trying to do with this system, I think that the functionality is a critical piece of that analysis. And then the cybersecurity issue, where's the demarcation between what the owner owns and what the provider owns? I mean, that's something that's fraught with potential disaster. So, and then the data loss, if you're transferring all of your data to a third party, it could go, if it goes away, you don't have it. We have some of our company data on SharePoint, and if for some reason that went away, we do not have it. Obviously we're making our own backups, but that when you transfer your data to a third party, that can be problematic. So, Min, why don't you take the on-prem discussion here then? And
Sure. So I'm going to be totally agnostic as possible, just weighing the pros and cons because I've seen both. In terms of pros, obviously lower recurring costs. You purchase the equipment, one shot, it's in your head and room. You're the one that's managing it and you're supporting it. So obviously it's a lower cost, it's a CapEx cost, not an op cost. Video unification, that's an interesting one. It tends to be easier for folks to actually run this on-prem because you basically just have everything there for them. And folks don't go crazy trying to figure out what the software is. And you probably may have to correct me if I'm wrong on this one. They don't have to go and look at different resources in order to unify any of the video at that point. More dealers accustomed to legacy architecture. I love that one. Integrators. I don't know if there's any integrators in here. Please don't kill me. Okay. Many of the folks I deal with that are integrators are very old school. All right, and I think this is a bigger challenge in terms of moving towards the cloud. Putting things on-prem is a lot easier because the integrators know what to do. Now, if you start putting systems on the cloud, many of the technicians could come in, do not understand what the hell it is. And I'll say that right off the bat. Every time I talk to them about the cloud, I get this blank stare, deer in the headlight look. Like, what are you talking about and how do I do this? And then we have to get the IT team involved. So with that said, a lot of the integrators I like to deal with systems that are legacy architecture that they understand, hardwired, don't have to configure, easier to deal with. Okay. In terms of cons, well, now it's someone else managing it. You typically don't, the owner typically doesn't manage that as often anymore. You're dealing with a third party who's managing your access control. So you basically are going to Brivo, oops, don't yell at me, okay? Or someone, if you have an issue, to say, hey, look, I have an issue with the access control, I need you guys to fix it. So, that's something you have to consider if you don't have anyone that's dedicated on your team to actually manage that, okay? Backups, my infamous ones. If you have no connectivity, such as the blackout in New York City, guess what? You're not getting any backups. You're basically having what's on the edge, and that's it. I think we had a recent incident in July in the upper Manhattan, where we had a Con Ed outage and everything went dark, no power, no traffic lights. You can't back up anything. You can't get any data. You're out, okay? You have the cost to maintain all the servers. So this is now, you're thinking OpEx now. This is a recurring cost that's gonna be constantly happening every year. So that has to be calculated into your customer's budget. So that's something to think about as you're designing these systems, to putting stuff in the cloud, because this is not something that they think about as the recurring costs that occur. Software licenses, any updates that has to happen. Managed services that has to come in. And this is probably on you, so you probably.
Yep, server crash,
First server crash, that's all you guys. And you don't know when it's going to happen. If they do updates or systems go down, this is up to them to tell you when that's going to happen. And majority of times, if it's a smaller company, you're not going to get those updates. Bigger companies, like Linnell with the managers, you do get updates, email updates that actually come to you. So you're aware when these updates are going to happen. So predictability in that respect is, with the bigger company, is a lot better at that point. Updates, infamous one is if you have firmware updates and you're unaware of it and something crashes, you're screwed. You have to reach out to third parties to actually come in and fix it. You don't have a legacy staff like an integrator who you can call and say, please come in and fix it right away. And then functionality of LAN and WAN. I think this is what we talked about. If there's blackout, you're screwed. You have no functionality whatsoever to actually.
Are you talking about infrastructure as a service?
We're talking about access as a service, access control. So this is all, majority of it is all access control. Okay.
And this slide is on the on-prem pros and cons. But then, obviously, with much of the access control architecture being virtually identical in both systems, it's, what are you doing with the data? Where's the database residing? On all these factors, power outages, you can have communications outages, which debilitate the system to a degree. You're still using panels and enclosures, so we still have to have some real estate in the building. You have proprietary and open architecture options with both cloud and on-prem, so they're on equal footing there. I think that from a cybersecurity standpoint, you can be dealing with older legacy panels of Mercury or whatever that are not, necessarily up to date with all of the cybersecurity controls, TLS, AES, 256, OSDP, and those types of things. I think both architectures are on equal footing with respect to wireless locks to a degree. And then really for companies that prefer an OpEx or a CapEx, you can go whichever way on that particular point there. So. The cybersecurity issues obviously run through, this entire process. When you think about it from the edge of the system to the core of the system, there's a lot to think about. So, Min, why don't you elaborate a little bit about some of these concerns?
So one of the big things with legacy architecture is it's still using the standard old the connections, composite connections that go back without any OSDP. It's been proven that systems like that can be hacked already, whether it's putting a sniffer behind a reader to actually capture cards, and that's been proven. So protecting these architectures is critical. The software is critical. Systems such as Brivo, or if you're pushing stuff to the cloud, things to think about is how do you configure these systems? Whose responsibility is it to configure these systems? And then who is running these systems? If your database gets lost or it's compromised, that means whatever customer you have, that critical information is now gone, and it's your responsibility now to actually secure that. So I don't know what your stance on it. Steve, is in terms of that security part of it, especially with cloud architecture. But that's something that I think would be interesting for folks to actually hear about.
You mean in terms of where the demarcation is and whose responsibility it is?
Yes, and also who is responsible for actually configuring.
So I think the first step, if you think about any IoT device, which is basically what all these security devices are, the less configuration that needs to be done, the better, because that way you're able to factory certify, so to speak, that this thing is going to be survivable in most environments. And so to give you a very concrete example, the smartest way to build these products from an attack surface point of view is to not have any open ports on the individual device. And so if you can't get into it from the outside, it's pretty hard to hack it. And so that is one of the fundamental things where you avoid a lot of bad situations that could happen. Other things that have evolved over the last 15 years is call home protocols, so that you don't have to do anything to the corporate firewall or to the corporate proxy server.
Right.
And so those are the strategies. And what it really comes down to is that I think today in the better systems, the individual devices that are on premise only require configuration with respect to the actual application service that they're performing. So the name of the device, for example, would be something, or other parameters that are important to the owner, use of static IP versus dynamic IP.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of things. If there's a proxy somewhere, then you have to tell it the IP address of that. But they're really not parameters that affect the security of the device in any way.
Not necessarily, but what we've been seeing is a lot of spoofing, and also the other thing that I don't know if folks realize, in 2016 there was a DEF CON hack with the Bluetooth reader for credentials, in terms of actually opening access using access control to unlock doors. So one of the key things is how do you secure that in terms of on the cloud. So that's something to think about as you're designing systems that are on the cloud, is if this system has been penetrated. If it's been compromised in the past, and how quickly the company is actually going to be able to fix that vulnerability that's been detected.
But so there are two aspects to this. We're kind of focusing on the on-premise vulnerabilities here. And I mean,
I think we're doing both. On-prem and we're going
on-prem in terms of the readers and the controllers and everything else. And absolutely, the phone home concept, only outbound ports and as few of those as possible. Everything else is locked down. End-to-end encryption, all fundamental. But the other thing to consider and think about, and again, it's at what level of service you're consuming it, is the cloud side. So if you're building out a highly complex system and you're very security aware, do you want to be dealing with an access control provider that basically you're reaching out to across the public network? Or do you want to have VPN connections and you're managing the software yourself from an infrastructure as a service perspective? There are engineering concepts there to consider in terms of keeping the network whole. If you are going with a basically a SaaS provider for access control, I think there are two conversations you need to be having. One is understanding, at least from the SaaS provider's perspective, where they're hosting and what the security protocols and disciplines and compliances are of that host provider, as well as with the application provider themselves, what their service level agreements and their policies are about data, how can you get at your data retention, all those things. You want to make sure you have all of those things covered. It's not just a cyber attack conversation,
no, it's not.
It's a data integrity conversation
but it's also,
as well.
And the other thing that has to be tackled is also human attacking, because a lot of the issues that actually challenges in cybersecurity is internal. It's not necessarily an attack from the outside. So stuff to think about as on-prem is where do you put the panel for these on-prem access control? If it's localized somewhere where it's in a public area, I don't think you want to put it there. You actually want to put it in a secured area. So things like that is stuff that you have to think of as well. So, I want to be as agnostic as possible. On-prem is a great solution for folks who actually don't understand what the cloud services mean or service providers do. But actually on-prem as well, you also have to consider what ramifications you would have if you install the cans actually improperly.
But you raised
one of the things that I think we all agreed to over drinks last night was that the gold standard, going back to the cyber question, the gold standard really, and a very easy discriminator for consultants or integrators to look at if they're recommending or considering, is does the provider have a history of cybersecurity audits by third parties.
diligence.
So due diligence,
Yeah.
outside auditors that certify and attest to the fact that this organization is actually living by the policies and procedures that they claim that they are.
Absolutely.
And that's really what the meaning of an audit is. Without that, you're just taking people at their word. And anybody, well, actually everybody says that they're secure and they did
Right.
this and this and this. But the only proof of that is whether there's any sort of compliance monitored by an external agency that's certified to do so.
And that's both in terms of attack vectors as well as
Right.
policy.
Penetration, policy,
Audits are
everything. Yeah.
fundamental and critical to
Exactly.
Yeah,
making sure
it's-
those are in place.
My question to go with that is, as we're preparing spec documents and all of that, one of the things that I try to do is reach out to the manufacturer and say, hey, can you provide me this cybersecurity statement or this penetration? Is this something that, because I get the sales speech from most folks that say, hey, we have a cybersecurity statement, or we do this. Can you provide that in documentation? Well, it's somewhere.
Demand it from a third party.
Exactly.
Right,
Man-
well,
I'm sorry.
Hold on, we need the
On
mic.
the cloud side, any provider should have a full information
Right.
security program that they can
Hand you.
Yeah.
And I'm
And-
gonna, I'm sorry.
The protocol actually for getting those things, the right way to do it is that if you were asking me, for example, what I would do is I would ask my auditor to send you that so that there was a chain of custody from the auditor to you. That is the right way to do it.
But don't just stop with the cloud provider. Again, if it's a SaaS solution that you're consuming, insist on the same from the
everyone.
application vendor.
So to answer your question as well, coming from the consultant, we actually just wrote 3 specifications already, specifically dedicated. We created 3 new ones dedicated to cybersecurity. One specific for manufacturers, which is basically any service provider, any manufacturer that's out there, that basically said these are the requirements, and it's a lot of it is all rules and policies that's in place. The second one is integrators, what the requirement of the integrator has to be in order to come in and actually do the installation for these devices. If you don't meet those qualifications, you're excluded. And then the third one is validation, the commissioning part of it, is how do we know that they actually did whatever they're doing in order to secure the system as requested? So that validation is critical, and that's done by a third party that Steve mentioned before. That's a critical piece of it in cybersecurity.
So another resource that I'll mention, it actually came up several times in conversations yesterday, is the Cloud Security Alliance, which is an organization, it's kind of a consortium or a trade organization of cloud providers. They have developed a certification program. It's called their STAR program. And you can go to their website and you can get the spreadsheet that all cloud service providers need to fill out in order to get STAR certification. If you want to, this is not as good as auditing, but if you want to, you can take that spreadsheet, throw it at providers, and ask them to fill it out if you have no other means of assessing whether they're even remotely secure and have policies in place.
But, I'm sorry.
Well, one of the things you made me think of a second ago that I think is fundamental as well, and we haven't touched on this yet. If you are going to go with an access control as a service provider, so you're doing the full stack kind of thing, or you're considering that, besides all the threat vector issues and the policy and compliance issues, privacy is a huge thing, privacy by design. So you're essentially giving your access control system to a third party to manage for you, which means they're going to have access into that system on your behalf. So do they have roles and permissions, and do they have audit trails on what user of that third party access control provider is getting into this end user system, and what are they doing when they're there? So privacy by design issues are becoming a very big deal. California's,
CCPA?
that's
CCPA,
coming up.
GDPR.
You've got the European issue.
Yeah.
Absolutely, pay attention to that as
Yeah.
part of your overall kind of compliance checklist when you're doing this.
So, and then the other thing I want to tag on to both yours is the fact that don't just get a list or start in a checklist. Make sure it's a due diligence because of those compliance reasons. One of the key things with compliance, especially if you do get hit with privacy regulations, is that they don't want to see that you just got a checklist. It has to be done legally by a general counsel who's actually doing all these steps. Because if you don't follow those steps, they won't see it as legitimate evidence. It's just there, contrary. So that's just something to think about with all these compliance regulations, which is now very, very stringent now, becoming more stringent.
All right, Cliff, how about total cost of ownership issues?
Oh, this one's mine, is it? Oh, great.
We deviated.
Build a model. Don't necessarily trust the vendor's models, right? And accept that it may not be cheaper to run it in the cloud, but again, it depends on what it is you're consuming All right, are you consuming the full software as a service capability? Are you just consuming the infrastructure? And build your models accordingly. Almost all infrastructure these days, if you're taking it out of a big data center or a big cloud provider, one of the big three, it's all billed on a utility basis. It's pennies per hour per compute and everything else that goes with that. Typically, as you go up kind of this hierarchy of services, though that utility concept is abstracted into something else like dollars per door per month, as an example. So you can expect, and it's been the case for a while now, and there's been a lot of very simplified analysis of this, that if you're actually paying dollars per door per month for a small access control system, you're probably going to be paying more for it after the first year or 18 months of ownership than if you had simply bought the computer and put it in place. But I find those analyses a little bit suspect because oftentimes, how long do you plan on keeping the equipment? Who are you contracting to actually manage the updates to the operating systems and to the application software? Who's doing the backups? So you have to roll into these total costs of ownership all the total costs of the ownership, right? And there's a lot of operational costs. Oftentimes these things in a small environment are either missed or not done, and that impacts that impacts the security of the environment. The more sophisticated the shop, the more likely they are to have those processes down to a fairly fine-tuned machine. But oftentimes they're also outsourced these days.
Yes, they are.
So develop a model, expect that operationally over time, moving it to the cloud is going to cost you more operationally, but it's going to save you from a capital perspective.
But also,
and in the end, I mean, there is an inherent efficiency here into moving this stuff into the cloud because the other thing that's often not considered is if you buy that computer, how much utilization are you really getting out of it? If you go into the cloud, you're absolutely only using you're only paying for what you use because it is all virtualized and is all fractionalized. So all of those things have to be balanced in here. So there's no simple answer to this. I expect operationally it might cost a little bit more, but again, you're saving a ton of money, probably not just in the capital expenses, but in the fact that somebody else's staff who's built a business and a discipline around this are doing those very low-level IT tasks, and you're not having to basically do them yourself.
And also on the risk side, you're putting the liability on the cloud service. Okay, so that's something to think about, especially when all the Steve, on the compliance side, all that risk now is going to the cloud provider, not you, because you're actually opening the contract with them. So that's also a benefit as well, if you think about it, is now you're taking the liability away. So it's all you.
Well, I'm still on TCO. So first of all, I agree with Cliff that there's never been a TCO model built that didn't show that the vendor's solution was cheaper than everything else, right? And I think we can all agree on that point. So what we've done there is we actually will provide people with a spreadsheet to do their own calculation. And it's got everything in it from the cost of your IT labor to the cost of the efficiency of your cooling system in your data center to the cost of electricity where you are and all the things that go into the cost of ownership of any computing machinery. And so you can adjust those things on your own and come up with your own answer. And that's where I do agree with Cliff, which is that you need to come up with your own answer, particularly in your role as consultants and being able to advise as to the particulars of that client. There are a variety of crossover points in these different cost curves. And so if you're looking at 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 doors, the fact of the matter is you'd only be using 5% of even the smallest computing device out there right now, whereas if you're getting that as a service, you're paying for the 5% that you're actually using. If you get to really, really large installations, 1,000 doors, 5,000 doors, 10,000 doors, something like that, your on-premise economies of scale begin to approach those of the cloud. And so, again, really depends whether you're looking at 10,000 corporate doors for a very large company or 10 doors for a more typical client.
I think too, though, when you get into these very large systems and you talk about having, a master application server and a regional servers, and you get all this redundancy, those costs do add up pretty quickly in the big systems.
The other thing you have to think about is with legacy architecture, there is no redundancy. You only have battery packs that are probably 4 hours, 2 hours, depending on the type of battery you put in these cans to support the doors. So you don't have that business continuity there. So that's something I also think about is do you want to take that risk and the liability if this is a critical door that you're actually installing with the critical door that you're putting in, and do you need that backup there and redundancy there? There is no redundancy in those doors.
Well, you can get that with generator power though, right? I mean, you have to have that anyway because all of your panels and all of that downstream architecture is at the site. So no matter what, it's more than the server. You're going to operate in a degraded mode, but power I don't think should be necessarily an issue if it's that critical. But
Well, yeah, well, agreed, but it depends on the size of the business as well, I think. If you're dealing with enterprise systems and customers, then yes, definitely. Smaller businesses that may not have the kind of funding, probably not.
absolutely. So I think we're concluding here that one size does not fit all, and there's no one or the other of these solutions that's correct in every situation. So you have to go through that front end analysis. A lot of hybrid activities that are occurring right now, and then really getting smart about how we validate the cybersecurity of the application, irrespective of where the data is being stored. So those are some of the key takeaways that we hope that we've provided to you today. And with that, we'll open it up for any other questions that you may have.
I have a question for everybody here. Are you folks deploying SaaS, any type of cloud service access control at this point? You are. Anyone else?
I have a lot of customers.
You have a lot of customers.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, really, if everything makes sense, but where the sweet spot is these large, but everybody's on track. But within the enterprise, there's hundreds of thousands of little locations that large corporations don't have the staff or the money for servers, and you might have a couple readers, 5 to 10 cameras, and once you do what I call a people, time, money study, just put it to the cloud. There's a backup gateway, and a lot of the large organizations are saying you got to get rid of 90% of your infrastructure, and that's really right now. I think the smaller sites are where within the enterprise for standardization and risk is where people are saying cloud is the right solution.
I think that's one of the classic hybridized
Yeah,
environments.
and
we're
then
alluding
the
to,
larger
where-
sites would have your
Exactly
full
so.
on-prem, and that's
Exactly
where we
so.
sit until it's all
Yeah.
magically.
Disappears. Sprinkle with fairy dust.
Yeah, so
Exactly.
it's slowly going, but there's a sweet spot right now where it's in. But it's the software as a service that auto updates. If you have, you're right. And what I've learned going into an enterprise account is we needed to build an information security program that we pass across the table for the end user, or you will never get through the vendor management process. And so I think if you're building cloud as a manufacturer, you should push back on them and say, what is your information security program? And there should be a group of engineers that should, we went out and hired an end user that took their whole organization to cloud, and she built that for us. So there's a lot of, coming from this has been a great session. There's a lot of questions you should ask, and the manufacturer should probably provide you a lot of information.
So I'm going to ask the question about who's doing SaaS. How many of you guys have encountered programs where you're doing infrastructure as a service, where you're actually taking legacy product or you're standing up new product, not necessarily in a multi-tenanted environment, but it's getting that stuff off-site, and you're having to encounter the cloud as basically a virtualized environment in place of the on-premise. Are you guys seeing a lot of that, or is that still tire kicking as well? Anybody doing those programs, projects?
As an integrator, I think it really is the demographic. So, if I'm selling, say, in Silicon Valley,
Right.
I'm eating my own, their dog food.
Oh, yeah.
You got to eat
Oh,
your
yeah.
own dog
Right.
food, right? So I'm kind of, it's interesting, great discussion panel. I see cloud mobility pushing.
We didn't even talk about the
Mobility, yeah, I
mobility
didn't
thing
even
at
touch
all,
that right now.
or the geographic dispersion,
And the
the
IDFs
motivations
that
there.
are unattended, or
Yeah.
the code on the wall
Right.
with the rocker panels. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes on. So,
Yeah. No, that's a really
I
good
would
point.
lean into the cloud, I would say, and even on the video. I think there's big strides being made on video that, I know we're talking access control centric, but look at Google and what they've done in the containers and the technology
Oh,
is
yeah.
coming forward.
Quantum computing, all
The
that nice
video
stuff.
content on the web, the content on the web is all going to be video soon.
Well,
Yeah.
the problem is saturation, network saturation. I don't think businesses have the network pipe to actually put everything to the cloud, especially with cameras going into
No
20
way.
megapixels.
Yeah, and census did. You got that. It's always that push and pull between resolution
Exactly.
and rate and bandwidth, and
Here
it's
comes
always
5G over the hill.
Yeah,
Well,
there-
that's
you know
another,
what?
that's another one.
I remember in 2000 when Enron was going to be selling bandwidth as a commodity because it was going to be infinitely large, and it's never happened. And you're always going to have this contention. And so again, at the higher end at the very high end of the security market, where you have high value assets or very complex organizations, big security staffs, GSOCs, and they want those 20 megapixel cameras. That video is probably on site somewhere, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to the cloud because it just doesn't make a whole lot of either technical or financial sense
Exactly.
to do it yet.
Right. And-
So it's just one of those things that's always now but I guarantee you're right. There are strides that are pushing it in that direction,
Agreed.
and eventually there will be more of it in the cloud than not. It's a step function in a way
Well,
to get it there.
storage and cold storage and things
yeah.
that you start
Yeah.
to see where the price points
So
are.
to give you a little idea, yesterday I did a little math. So a 20 megapixel camera will be about 8 gigabits per second going out on that just one camera. So if you do the math, that's substantial. And I don't see a lot of companies putting that to the cloud right now at this point.
No way.
But again, hybrid systems.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Because what you do see is a lot of that storage, consumed locally, and then interesting things are either decimated or they're archived and they're pushed to the cloud for long-term storage. So you end up having to have kind of the ability to basically route appropriately to the appropriate store for that video. So the video routing technologies are becoming more sophisticated so that you can basically disperse that storage. But storage in the cloud's cheap, right? And will be. It's really more
Hopefully
of a
soon.
network constraint than
Exactly.
anything else. And the tolls that the vendors will charge you for using it, right? So some of the big public cloud providers, and again, unless you have a solution provider that's got a really nice contract with a cloud provider, just kind of as a standard thing, they won't charge you much for putting it into the cloud. They won't charge you much for keeping it. They're going to charge you for getting it back again, right? So
I do know some folks that sell petabytes of storage if you need.
yeah,
And they're getting
yeah,
cheaper.
Yeah.
Well, and with the petabyte storage, for the on-premise of cameras, things like that, if you've got these 20 megapixel cameras, if you've got petabytes worth of storage, and especially with you were talking about real estate being prime. A lot of those companies are saying, okay, we want our data center offsite. We want our redundant ring. We're going to lease that fiber. We're going to do that because going to a Metro E leased line is expensive. But total cost of ownership, I can put dark fiber in the ground on a 10-year lease, and I beat that lease line 5 times over in that process. And so companies are beginning to do that and realizing how do I mitigate this without having. I can't go to the cloud because it doesn't make sense. Either I can put it up there and pull it out. The other thing that's coming into it is, and I recently heard this for nobody in here, but so it's cloud is also what people are willing to pay, right? So cloud provider, the cloud camera provider, access control, whatever, they give the integrator a certain amount of, it's your price is this, you mark it up whatever you want to, it's whatever the customer's willing to pay. One provider, his MSRP or his number to the integrator was $12 a month for whatever device they were putting in. The customer have to be, or the integrator have to be in the Bay Area. The going rate for whatever he was doing is $380 a month. So he charged $380 a month for a $12 item.
Wow.
Good business for him.
Good business for
business
him.
then.
But all of a sudden you're seeing
I know, right? It's good to know.
you've got customers that are looking at that going, MSRP on this is only $25 a month, but my cost is $380. I can do a lot of fiber in the ground for $380 a month per camera.
I don't think he's going to get away with that price point for
No.
very long.
No, this transparency will take care of that.
Yeah, and as a consultant, I think you're going to get yourself
Yeah.
into a lot of trouble with that one. I'm sorry.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Wasn't my consultant.
Just saying.
Phil?
Yep. One of the things I've seen change is our clients are now, and prospects are identifying the cost that they are spending for the inputs and keeping their systems
Yep.
up and running. When you talk about most clients, when you really talk to them, they want the output. They want the reports. They don't, but in order to support it, they have all these inputs of firmware and servers. And so when you really when we've taken a client through that, they go, I never knew we were spending this much. I mean, it's they're thinking they're spending half as much. But when you talk about the servers and you talk about the infrastructure and you talk about the upgrades and you talk about the staff that they have that's administering the system.
You're talking an on-premise system and all the hidden costs.
It's
Yeah.
It's a really big number.
It is.
It's back to your spreadsheet, basically.
It is.
So I think clients are identifying now, going, or whether it's a CFO that's going, how many people do you have supporting our access control system? It's just it's a big number. So I think that's one thing that
I think that's
we're
dead
seeing
on.
that will tip it, as long as you can provide that infrastructure as a service at a cost, dealing with the liability of having to do that. Of
That's the
owning their system.
Yeah.
I think we got to get through that. But I think there is a trend toward this. The other thing we did is talk about eating your own dog food. We took our access control system for our sites, and we have a number of sites. And there's another part of the company, now that we're part of ADT, they have a managed service platform. So we took our system and put it on the managed service platform, trying to figure out, okay, instead of doing a proof of concept with a client, we're doing a proof of concept with us,
Yep.
That's
to
the best way.
deal with the issues. And we found a lot of, we've identified a lot of areas that we didn't recognize where we need to have support in certain areas. So I think, but at least we're piloting that where in the past it's been an idea.
Well, you as a consultant, in my mind, or us playing the role of a consultant, you have to test these devices. If you don't test these devices, I hate to say it, then you shouldn't,
Yeah, we're an integrator, and so we test everything.
You have to, yeah.
Yeah, and
even as a
because
consultant, I believe.
the manufacturers in the room, they sell beyond the capabilities of the system.
There's
I'd
one
say,
sitting
really
behind you.
politely. Right.
Just saying. I know, that's why I'm able to say that.
Of course.
The funny thing is, it's a bifurcated world.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
And most of these big, even companies, tech companies, they've got a whole other thing off the smaller sites that they're running
Oh, yeah.
outside of the whatever enterprise class.
But I think Frank nailed it. There is not one size fit all. It doesn't exist. It's basically dependent on clientele, and it's a migration pattern. And I mean, I'm dealing with some big real estate developers right now, and they have antiquated, still using prox cards, not even cards that are encrypted properly. And I asked them, it's like, are you going to rip out these card readers? Because I really think you need to do it, because all these systems that you have that are critical are sitting in these areas that really shouldn't use these type of card readers. Oh, it's working fine, don't worry, it's too expensive to rip it all out, because it's expensive. And they're still using 20-year-old technology on these doors.
And what Sarah said earlier about these smaller sites, on these enterprise systems where it's got to go on CorpNet, we're seeing a trend where they don't want it to be on CorpNet. That I think that is the entry point into these large enterprises.
I think it's absolutely true. Yeah. The orders take too long.
Yep.
The build out takes too much. The site they may shut it down and move it across the street because the real estate's cheaper. Yeah, a fully virtualized environment in those places makes infinite sense, as long as you can basically bring it back in to the global architecture. If you're a large campus or a large enterprise provider, I think that continuity is important. But absolutely, that is the place where you'll see this stuff start first. Yeah, I completely agree. And having getting that program document is completely critical. Yeah.
Well, customers need to have that regardless. It's not just the manufacturers. Customers need to have those roles, those policies and procedures to the T for cybersecurity.
And the service levels and everything else that goes with that.
Excellent. Anything else?
Nope.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.